Some hop varieties need some help. Some hop varieties are good supporting players, playing off of yeast, malt, playing background notes of spiciness and herbal flavors. And then there are some hops that when you use them, it's basically cheating. Citra and Galaxy are two of those. They have these huge, bright flavors of citrus, tropical fruit like guava. There's almost nothing more delicious than a well-brewed Citra Galaxy IPA. So I wanted to harness that. Make a batch for Sapwood Cellars that would be pouring at the Love Thy Beer Winter Warmer Showcase in Silver Spring that would really highlight Citra and Galaxy. So we called it Cheater Hops. For the yeast, I went with a can of Imperial Yeast Citrus. It had been sitting in my fridge since last summer, and it seemed like it was probably time to use it. This is their version of Sactois, the strain that was originally called Brettois. It's a wild Saccharomyces strain that has the ability to produce these fantastic, fruity, citrusy flavors, and maybe a little funk too. One of the things that made people assume it was Brettanomyces is that it has the ability to ferment dextrins. And so it can have this long fermentation, making something that resembles Brettanomyces pellicle quite a bit. In this case, though, I was happy to use the Imperial yeast because it comes with 200 billion cells, which is a big leg up if you're trying to build up a starter for 10 gallons. In this case, though, being 6 months old, I decided it was still worth making a 2.5 liter starter. I probably have a well-deserved reputation for taking some shots at producers that I don't think do a great job or make unreliable products, so credit where credit is due. This stir starter has been going strong now for I think 7 or 8 years. I've never had trouble with it. The base is a little bit diminutive compared to the big 5-liter starter. I did break a 5-liter starter previously, but other than that, it's been a champ. And now, usually, if I'm going to put that big Erlenmeyer flask on it, I'll just put a couple of books on either side. Nothing that you wouldn't expect. 80% raw 2-row brewer's malt, 12% Briess flaked wheat, 6% chit malt, and just 2% Briess Crystal 10. Just trying to add a little bit of sweetness, a little bit more malt depth than some of the other ones I've brewed. For water treatment, I went with 16 grams of gypsum and 9 grams of calcium chloride. This is a little bit lower and a little more shifted towards sulfate than I usually go. This is a higher gravity beer. It's got more malt, and that malt itself will be adding chloride and sulfate. I did a little test on this and wrote it up for BYO a few months ago. I'm not sure that this is the ideal approach, but for the time being, I have been boosting mineral content on lower gravity beers and reining it in a little bit on higher gravity beers where you're already getting a lot of mineral from the malt. I don't brew a lot of big beers anymore. I'm used to drinking beers that are in the 5 to 6.5% range for most of these hoppy beers. So when I'm targeting a gravity like 1073, I may have miscalculated. I was forced to extend the boil by about 45 minutes to hit my target gravity, but that's a good lesson to test your gravity before the boil goes and before you start adding hops, and make those adjustments, collect a little bit more wort, boil a little bit longer to hit your target gravity. To balance out that higher amount of malt and the sort of commensurate rise in proteins and dextrins and sugars and malt flavor, I went a little bit heavier handed on the bittering addition than I usually would. Still, just about 4 ounces of Columbus with 15 minutes left. I say bittering charge, but really most people are going to consider that a flavor or even an aroma addition. To boost that aromatic addition, though, I went with 12 ounces at Flameout. That included more Columbus and Simcoe and Amarilla. The Simcoe was actually 2014 harvest. I had it stored in the freezer, vacuum bagged. It smelled fine. I wasn't worried about it. I actually don't have any problem with using older hops on the hot side. They've got those delicate aromatics that they've probably been destroyed by then, by the heat, and by fermentation, they're going to be gone anyway. Those Flameout additions were added right at Flameout. I didn't pre-chill the wort at all. This is a big beer again. I wanted those IBUs. So I let them steep for about 30 minutes before chilling. I chilled down to 70 Fahrenheit with my immersion chiller. It's got that recirculating arm. I'm often asked why I add Whirlflock to my hazy IPAs. It isn't about clarity. As you'll see, this beer isn't particularly clear. It's about leaving behind more break material in the kettle. By allowing the wort to sit, I get a higher proportion of wort to trub into the fermenter. This allows for more beer from the same size fermenter and a purer yeast to harvest and repitch. I split the star between the two identical fermenters. No changes at this point. The split in this batch happened with the dry hops. Imperial citrus can be really nice fermented around 70 Fahrenheit. But if you want to go up into the mid to high 70s, you really can increase that ester production, making it a fruitier, brighter strain. In this case, I wanted it restrained to take on just a supporting role with those hops taking the lead. The next day, I realized that the O-ring on one of the SS brew bucket racking arms had been twisted a little bit, pinched, and was beginning to leak. It took me a few minutes, pretty intense minutes, trying to get it reseated again. I untwisted it, making the leak worse, but allowing me to get that gasket back lined up and then tightened it back down. Sometimes I miss carboys, but the advantages are probably still worth it. Both batches fermented without issue. About 24 hours in, the airlocks were bubbling rapidly. I didn't open them to look, but obviously that yeast was very happy. The fermentation temperature hung around the high 60s. 3 days into fermenting, I dry hopped both. The half was Citra Galaxy, creating those bright, fresh, citrusy flavors. For the other half, I went with Belma and Mosaic for a more fruity berry IPA. This was my first batch with Belma, and I thought Mosaic would be a good foil to prevent it from being too strawberry forward, too fruity. Mosaic has some of those blueberry notes that would go well with it, but also has some of those danker notes to help cut through the fruitiness. A week later, once those hops had settled out, I was ready to keg. I add a second dose of dry hops to each with the same varieties. In this case, 3 ounces of each in a metal hop screen. That was about all that hop screen could handle. When I was cleaning out the keg afterwards, it was, the hops had expanded and it was basically full to the top. Next time, probably 4 or 5 ounces is as most as I'd go with. Often at this point, I'd simply put the kegs into the kegerator, attach them to CO2, vent the headspace, and allow them to cool and force carbonate. For this one, though, where I was going to be serving it to the public and I wanted to make sure that every scrap of oxygen was taken up, I decided to prime. I used 1 gram of rehydrated CBC1 yeast and a few ounces of sugar. This strain was selected for rapid action and only being able to ferment simple sugars. The goal there is that you're not going to get any additional attenuation. It's going to work quickly, absorb all that oxygen, and then drop out easily. I went through all the same precautions I usually would, purging the keg after putting the hops into it and filling through the dip tube, using the bouncer inline filter to catch any debris. To each keg, I also added 1 milliliter of hexalone, and isomerized hop extract. Enough to only add 4 or 5 IBUs, but it was supposed to add a wonderful, terrific long-lasting head, and maybe just a little more smoothness and roundness to the body. Previously I'd used tetralone, which is similar, but with a slightly different configuration. After a week of warm conditioning, I moved both of them to the fridge. Again, I gave it a week cold just to help to precipitate out any additional yeast, hop particulate, anything like that that might be in suspension. When I went to dump that first pint of beer to remove any trub that was in there, I got a surprise from the Mosaic Belma. It really spurted out high carbonation, and I was surprised. I had, if anything, undercarbonated. 3 ounces of sucrose in a keg shouldn't produce really high carbonation. So I was a little bit worried, but the Citra Galaxy was maybe a hair more lively than I expected, but it was, for the most part, about the carbonation you'd expect. What I suspect is going on is something that's referred to as hop creep. This is relatively recent research that hops actually can provide an enzyme that will break down dextrins in the beer into fermentable sugars. And Mosaic is one of the more aggressive hop varieties as far as this goes. In this case, however, where I had active yeast going and a whole load of Mosaic, I end up with overcarbonation. I've heard a few brewers mention that 58 degrees Fahrenheit is their magic number for getting good aroma extraction from the hops without allowing the yeast to continue working. I wonder, though, if some of this conversion of relatively flavorless dextrins into relatively sweet sugars is part of that perceived juicy sweetness that some New England IPAs have. Scott and I had a blast pouring our test batches. He poured Concentrated, which was a white wine double IPA, that he goosed up with a little white wine extract, some white wine yeast, and 2 hop varieties, Nelson Sauvin and Hallertau Blanc, that have big, bold, juicy white wine flavors reminiscent of Sauvignon Blanc. The reception we got was wonderful from local beer nerds. A whole slew of people came up and said something along the lines of, I live down the block, I work next door, I'm so excited for you guys to open. And we're super excited to be open too. The reception was warm from other Maryland craft brewers as well. We got to chit-chat with a whole fantastic group of people that welcomed us with open arms. You'll likely get a chance or two to catch our beers again in Maryland at various other festivals before the brewery opens in summer 2018.
I enjoy drinking double IPAs. They're just not always the best thing for me to have on tap available because I love consuming liquid. I will drink a glass of water if you put it in front of me. And something with 7.5% alcohol to me really has to justify that. If it doesn't have a better mouthfeel or a bigger aroma than a beer that's 5 or 5.5, I'd rather take the lower alcohol beer, all things being equal. So for this one, we wanted to brew something for a beer fest. And at a beer fest where you're only having an ounce or two, you really want that beer to wow somebody because they're going to be trying a whole bunch of different things. So Citra and Galaxy, easy choices, both really bright, beautiful hops. Citra, in this case, provides this wonderful citrusy character, tangerine, lemon, something like that. And that Galaxy really comes through with big tropical flavors, guava, pineapple, mixing maybe a little bit with that wild Saccharomyces, that Sactois. Yep, that is everything I want in an IPA. It is big, it's bold, it's beautiful. It has a decent amount of bitterness to it. Not over the top, not that classic West Coast palate-wrecking, scraping, lingering flavor, but it also isn't juice. This is still an IPA. It's an expression of everything that hops bring, and that's aromatics as well as some bitterness. Really dig the appearance. Great head retention, great lacing thanks to both that chit malt and that hop extract, that hexalone. How about the Mosaic Belma? A tiny bit more subdued. I don't know if that's the Belma, maybe just doesn't have the oomph, the volume that Citra and Galaxy does. Mosaic is certainly in that same category in terms of assertive aroma, or the fact that I had to purge out a little extra CO2 on this one. It's a really different experience. It's not nearly as bright. It has much more of a berry flavor, strawberries. If you put a gun to my head, I could say blueberries, and that's often a common descriptor for Mosaic. I've never really gotten it. To me, Mosaic has more of a dankness along with sort of a resiny, fruity character. But it helps to cut through the Belma. It helps to keep it from being too berry-licious. Similar balance though, not too much bitterness, but it's definitely present. Still really bright and fresh, no oxidation even at almost 6 weeks old. Yeah, I mean, I'm really happy with the way this turned out. I don't know how much that hop extract is really adding. The head doesn't seem particularly fantastic. Certainly some really nice lacing there, but the retention, it's not, still standing up an 1.5 inch head after a few sips. I may keep playing with it. I might try to up that dosage just a little bit. There is usually a warning that if you add too much hexalone, at a certain point, the head retention becomes artificial in appearance. I don't know exactly what that means. Chunky, weird structure, something like that. Maybe I'll add a couple of drops and pour another glass and see if I can get it to really get weird. But hey, another recipe brewed, and another step closer to Sapwood Cellar's opening. We're still on track for a June grand opening. Hopefully by the end of March, we'll have our brew house in place. We'll have our fermenter soon after that, and we've got all sorts of licensing and permits and whatever between now and then. So I'll stay busy, but hopefully I'll have time to brew a couple more test batches before committing to 10 barrels of something. As always, you can get the full recipe details and some photos and written out tasting notes. There's a link down in the description of this video. Until the next time, cheers.